Hello friends I made this for. Welcome. My name is Lauren and today is video number 1 of my first 3-part series on Saturn at the end of 2020. In this 3-part series, I'm going to talk to you about what is Saturn, what sign is Saturn in right now, and what sign is Saturn moving into at the end of this retrograde. So, buckle up because Saturn's like my favorite planet. This could be a subject that I could do a mini-series on in all its incarnations looking at Saturn. That's even talking about Saturn returns, Saturn and how it shows up in our everyday life, and of course how Saturn shows up in tarot. And of course we're going to be looking at that. For video 1, this one that you clicked on, we're going to be talking about Saturn as it is in the tarot. Just a quick overview to kind of like unbox what Saturn has to teach us. Because this planet right here, this one, yes, this little guy, it gets a lot of hate from a lot of different people. And it deserves being unboxed in a different way. So when we're talking about Saturn, I really want to encourage you to redesign your opinion on this planet, or redesign your narrative around this planet, because there's a lot of narratives. And even with us when talking about tarot, there's so many narratives. Have you ever said a word so much you fucking forgot how to say it? I think I just did. Ha! So, yes, Saturn has stationed direct today. And so I think that's why my feelings around wanting to talk about Saturn are at an all-time high. Of course, as always, I'm not an expert, I'm just a human person. So what I say might not resonate with you, but I sure hope that it at least tickles your hairs a little bit to open up your concept of what this planet and its medicine might be for you. So if you're like me, you've turned or are about to turn 30 years old this year, you are at the end of your Saturn return. But it's not over yet because Saturn went back into Capricorn while it was retrograding this summer. So before we can talk about Saturn in Capricorn and where it will be, and Saturn in Aquarius, we have to unpack what is Saturn. Because like I said, there's a lot of narratives around this sign and what it represents. So let's jump into it. Starting with the tarot. Well, actually, back up. Let's talk about Saturn and what it's not. Or at least let's talk about the story of Saturn and what we can evolve out of it. Because Saturn, this guy, this friend, this buddy, is very often associated with restrictions. And with the idea of restrictions comes the negative connotation that your Saturn return or Saturn in retrograde is inherently painful and bad. Now, change can inherently sometimes be painful because it's through change that we grow and feel ourselves pushing. It doesn't have to be misery necessarily, but we will become uncomfortable, right? Because that's part of change, is embracing discomfort. So in one avenue, yes, it might not be comfortable to work with Saturn all the time. Perhaps it even is daunting for all my friends who are about to have their Saturn return, just trying to wrap your heads around it. But the truth is, this planet is not just strictly about restrictions. A thing that I get really bothered by is this talking of Saturn as if it's your dad who disapproves of what you do. I feel like that tends to be the visualization. We almost associate Saturn with a lot of things we associate with the Emperor, which is unfortunate because the Emperor is actually a really empowering card when we're looking at it in the tarot. But the connotations around it can often be negative, that it's a bad thing, that it's the patriarchy. And that's just not the case. Planets or tarot cards are not inherently good or bad. A retrograde is not inherently going to fuck up your whole life. However, when we are in a certain space and we perceive things in a certain way, we might start to lean in that direction because we might lean into thinking this is already negative and putting ourselves into that mindset. FYI, I've been teaching social emotional learning this year, and I can tell you what, I'm learning a lot about how to unpack negative and positive connotations in a way that's not necessarily focused on negative or positive. Because the truth is, saying something is negative or something is positive is a human experience, right? We decide whether something is negative or positive for us. But the truth is, when we're talking about things in more of a cosmic understanding, these things are not negative or positive. They are experiences. And this can be really challenging for us to unpack, looking at something as restrictions as being a positive thing. But when we're talking about Saturn and the big themes around it, there are three main chapters that I would like us to kind of dive into, or themes, I guess. There's the theme around completion, structures, and container. So structures and container might sound like they're the same, but they're not, and I'll talk to you more about that in just a second, because they can be internal and external, right? Our structures are more of an external experience. So structures like our job, structures like the government, structures like living in a society, right? That's a structure. A container, to me, is more of an internal factor. So when we're talking about Saturn and we're talking about specifically container and structures, that's kind of what I'm talking about and differentiating those two ideas. So let's dive in to what is Saturn and what is Saturn in the tarot. So you already know the answer to this question if you clicked on it, because it is the world. And I think honestly, when we look at the world through the tarot, it helps us unpack some of our baggage around Saturn and expand our understanding of Saturn. Because Saturn is finite, but not necessarily only restrictive, right? There's so many aspects to it, and there's so much to unpack. So let's start with talking about our three decks. We have the Cosmic Tarot, the Way Home Tarot, and of course, you know, the goodie, the classic, the baddie, bad, in a good way. The Smith-Waite? Yes. Can't always remember, but when I do, it's because I look around and don't see the answer. So we're going to be looking at Saturn through the tarot through three different decks, because of course that's what I wanted to do. It's what I love doing, is connecting tarot with astrology to help us expand our idea around a different sign or a planet. So let's unpack the world, starting with the oldest. So this is the world from the Smith-Waite deck. And this is probably, it is the sign that really are the image that we really can associate with the world. So let's break down some imagery first. Around this figure that is inside a wreath, which is a wreath of a winner, we have all the fixed signs. The person in the center is also holding two wands that we originally saw in the hand of the magician. There's a lot of visual cues here, but it can be kind of hard to read what they all mean because there's just so much going on here. So one thing I want to also throw out there is Saturn in the old way of astrology before we had other planets, really. I mean, we always had the other planets, but before we knew they were all there, Saturn was not only the sign of Capricorn, it was also the sign of Aquarius. Of course, that has evolved since the discovery of Saturn, but just something interesting to keep in mind. It helps us kind of unpack the fact that Saturn is not as simple as like big daddy Capricorn energy and like here to make you suffer, daddy. Like here to put the ball gag in your mouth, daddy. That's not what this sign is about, right? This sign is, or this planet is about so much more. And so one of the first things I want you to unpack is around this idea of completion. The reason why I want to bring up completion is because in the tarot, Saturn represents the end of the Fool's journey. And of course we know that once we're done with the Fool's journey, it's not over. We just started over in a different form, in a different capacity, in a different space mentally than we did prior. So this is important to keep in mind because we're talking about Saturn as a halfway point for us, right? When we reach our Saturn return, and I'll try not to get too deep into the mythos of this, when we get into our Saturn return, there's often this feeling of we are starting something big, and by the end, we might feel like we're starting to resolve the story that we started. So interesting thought, right? This is literally where we go before we re-begin the Fool's journey. So when we look at Saturn through the theme of completion, I want you to think about Saturn almost coming to us, especially when we're in our Saturn return, as an indicator of what have we learned? Up into this point, up into this moment, what have we learned? Have we learned anything? My cat's trying to get into the room. She won't get in. She might cry though. Please ignore. So when we are faced with Saturn, depending on what's happening in our own chart or what's happening in the world, Saturn can be a place where we ask, what have I accomplished? What work have I finished? Or what work have I kind of worked through up until this point? Because like I said, you're not done. You're just ready to start the next journey. The next space. I also want to bring attention to the fact that this wreath, this like victory wreath, is very similar to the rings of Saturn. So there's actually this really interesting visual that we see in this card that reflects back. The image of the figure holding the two wands is also really important because what it represents is this focus on reclaiming power, right? So a few other things to unpack before I move to the next card. There is this feeling of restriction, right? There's this feeling of structure because we're literally encased in this wreath. But here's the important thing to remember about limitations or structures. When we live in a finite world, when we live in a real world with that we can touch and feel and connect and be intuitively driven into, we also have to know where our physical limits lie so that we can manifest to our full potential. And this can be a really important reminder that Saturn is here to offer us. It's not just a matter of I can manifest anything out of the blue. Saturn reminds us you can, but you have to back it up with work. Work. That's the ultimate big thing, and I think people get really thrown off with Saturn is that it's not about the infinite divine is all around us. It's, yeah, it is, but like, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to utilize your resources? When we talk about Capricorn in my next video, it's really going to bring home this idea that it's not just a matter of what are we connected to, or what can we manifest, or what do we have at our disposal. It's how do we utilize, right? It's more than just that. There's a lot to unpack here. So let's go to the next card. And the next card I want to show you is the Cosmic Tarot. So we can already see between these two cards, there's a really obvious connection. There's a really obvious play between these two cards. And we can see this in the world is basically showing us the same kind of figure, the same imagery surrounding said figure, but there's more freedom. There's more of this feeling of liberation that I wish was more involved with Saturn when we talk about Saturn on a daily level, right? Because when we're talking about Saturn, we are talking about structures, but we're also talking about the container. So what do I mean about container? So Saturn is really about the physical, right? To a certain extent, it is not so much the heady shit, but what do we know? And how do we utilize that? To me, this card really, this like incarnation of it really talks about, or really expresses the idea of how do we show up and drop in. Because how we show up in the physical world, like how we drop in with our empathy, with our feelings, with how we relate to others and their situations, that's very Saturn as well. When we block ourselves off and our ideologies to be more restrictive, that's problematic. And Saturn is usually here to show us where we are having blind spots. When we open ourselves up to possibility, and not be so rigid in our understanding of the world or rigid in our belief system, we are opening ourselves up to a deeper capacity for pleasure, for love, for understanding, for connection, and to our divine source, right? But using this as a tool, if we're relating it back to like one thing, looking at this image, we see there's this feeling of flow, of becoming more open. Yes, restrictions can make us feel like we're limited, but restrictions also show us where we can step into our power. So one last card before we are done talking about it. Structures and container, right? So structures can really allude to our belief system. Structures can talk about what society we have to work with and experience. What sort of things do we work with, engage in? But also, what are we ignoring? Because the work around Saturn will always be about our blind spots. Because the truth about Saturn is that we cannot ascend, we cannot move past certain facets of reality if we ignore reality, right? So Saturn acts as a reminder that resistance is not how we engage in the infinite. Right? We have to be willing to perceive something that opens us. And sometimes what opens us makes us uncomfortable. Saturn is really big in this idea that through this discomfort, however minor or intense, it's important to our healing process. It's important to remove the blinders, because Saturn very often, when we're working with Saturn, when we're looking at where it is, we're seeing where our blind spots are in the world, right? So as Saturn is going direct today, we might be, depending on your chart, you might be feeling heavy shit. You might be having a lot of things coming up. You might be really questioning why you believe something. And do you really? Do you have any evidence, or is it all based on feeling? Is it your feeling or somebody else's? Because that's also the thing, right? When we're talking about Saturn, we're talking about how we engage in the world, in the universe. It's not just the world. It's everything in it. So, my last point, my last things I want to bring up is with Saturn, you might start to feel like the container, you are the container. What you have to hold might be requiring you to release. Especially right now as Saturn is going direct and we are starting to move. Saturn is going to be moving into Aquarius. So in my next video, I'm going to talk about what the themes around Capricorn Saturn looks like, but also what to expect as we're transitioning into Saturn in Aquarius, because this is a huge shift. This is where we're going to feel a lot of things. If you are finishing up your Saturn return, you know it. You feel it. You can already tell there's some deep shit about to come up and be felt for you. If you are about to start your Saturn return, same thing. And if you are not even around that Saturn return, it doesn't matter because Saturn's coming. And so is Pluto. Saturn and Pluto are both coming. But this is the last thing I want you to think of when you think of the world and Saturn, is how are you judging things? How are we stepping out and back into the full? And how are we moving to the next step of our life, death, rebirth? Because as I said, this is the last card in the major arcana. Maybe I didn't say that, but that is the last card. This is the last card before we go to the full. So when we're talking about Saturn, think about that a little bit. What have you learned in the past 2.5, 3 years? What have been the themes? Because even if you're not going through your Saturn return, or you didn't, or you're about to, whatever the case is, completion structures container. We are the container. The society is our structure. And what have we completed within both of these areas? What have we grown through? What have we experienced? And where is the blindfold and where might we need to take it off? Because Saturn is not just a short-term thing. What shows up in your Saturn is actually very much tied to our existence from birth, our structures, our container. So every time Saturn goes through its thing, it might feel like, oh, this isn't related to me. But always, I encourage you, restructure what you think of Saturn, but also notice where it is and how it shows up for you. So, with that said, thank you for sticking around and learning a little bit about Saturn, learning about the world and the tarot, all of these amazing things. I look forward to coming back talking about the devil in Capricorn next time. So please stick around or come back. I don't know. I have issues with being abandoned, I guess. And I will see you another time. Enjoy your Saturn direct. Bye.